So, Lone Rider here, and as you might imagine, I have a variety of different types of swords. Here we have just a few of them. So we've got a homemade gladius. I made this out of mild steel. We have a cold steel Hutton training saber, and then we have this. I think is particularly cool. I made this myself, but you can't really tell by looking at it. I think it's pretty well done. This is a sword cane, and inside we have a um, sharpened fencing blade and metal ferrules, and just kind of fits together nicely. So, and it is usable as a cane. There's a little rubber thing on the end. I made that after watching the Sherlock Holmes movie with Robert Downey Jr. I just thought, I was like, oh wow, that's pretty cool. One of the characters had a sword cane, and I was like, I want one, so I made one. I've got a few other things. I've got a long sword, I've got a katana, I've got a rapier, etc. But those are all modern reproductions and things like that. What I wanted to talk about was real swords. And when I say real swords, I don't mean a sword that's built to be functional, because that could, after all, include any sharp modern reproduction that's properly made. I wanted to talk about historical swords when I say real swords. I mean swords that were actually used in battle or could have been. And I have an example here of a short saber or hanger. This is from the 18th century, so the 1700s, possibly into the early 1800s. The general belief in my family is that it was from the War of 1812 here in America. I'm inclined to believe it was actually more the American Revolution, but maybe slightly after, maybe in the intervening years. The main reasons for that is the style of grip is very similar to hilts that were around in the late 1700s and early 1800s. So you've got a slotted hilt with a knuckle bow and an ivory or bone grip with vertical lines inscribed on it. And there's an eagle head pommel. Now, like I said, this is a short saber. It's what would probably be properly called the hanger. But you'll see it's got a wide blade, and it's fairly thick at the base, but then it tapers down and gets narrow here to about what we'd expect. And then here it gets incredibly narrow towards the end. And it's worth noting it was sharpened on the back, what's called the false edge, and on the front when it was original. I still wouldn't want to get hit with this, but it's not what I would call sharp, at least not anymore. But then it's possibly 200 years old. Now, the reason I brought this up is because although it's incredibly thick at the base of the blade, and if we take down a modern reproduction saber, we can kind of see this. The original was a lot thicker where the back of the blade, the spine of the blade, meets the hilt. The original being the real one from the the American Revolution or thereabouts. The reproduction saber here is thinner by far. However, they both have distal taper. It's just the original starts out a lot thicker at the base of the blade, and it gets a lot thinner at the end. Now, I understand why they didn't want to make this quite as thin towards the end. It's a training sword, and it's supposed to be a little robust, therefore. Also, nobody's going to be using that to cut with, so it doesn't have to be thin near the end, which is, after all, the business end of a saber from about here down. Now, here's the thing. This sword, or saber if you want to call it, short saber, hanger, however you want to put it, like all sabers, has a surprising amount of heft in the hand. In other words, it's very forward-weighted. It wants to fall. It wants to chop. It wants to slice. However, this sword is not what I would call heavy. In fact, again, if you look at the distal taper, one of the things that surprised me when I noticed this, it's not just that it's thicker at the base, it's how thin it gets near the end. And in fact, for at least the second half of the blade, this is thinner than a light, narrower training sword. So this would have been an incredibly good cutter, but it also would have been very, very quick in the hand, very, very easy to use. This is something that I would not have hesitated to carry into battle in its original condition, and I'm pretty sure the people at the time didn't either, because swords like this were very heavily used, both in America and on the continent. Now, here's the thing. Why am I bringing this up? I'm not suggesting you go out there and get your hands on a 200-year-old antique sword and start swinging it around. Obviously not. I don't make a habit of swinging this around precisely because it is old. Normally it just sits on a shelf. But I wanted to take it out and handle it because I think you should handle an original at least once in your life if you're into swords. Or, if you can't, a reproduction that's made to the same proportions as an original. So, real swords often handle differently. A lot of times it's a known thing that a lot of more inexpensive reproductions might not get the balance right or the weight distribution right. That's as may be. A lot of them are known for not having much, if any, distal taper. But here's the thing. There's also something to be said for the fact that a real sword, or a historical sword, I should say, is going to handle differently a lot of the time. And I'm not sure I can put a thing on the number. If you look at the blade length, if you look at the width, if you look at the thickness, if you look at the point of balance, which on this is fairly far out, especially considering its overall length is quite short. I don't know what to say. This on paper, by the statistics, should be a fairly heavy, cumbersome sword, and yet it's something that I would definitely be comfortable, using if I had to use a saber and was trained in the use of a saber. So, at least in its original condition. Now it's obviously pretty rough. This does not feel heavy. This feels light and nimble and responsive. And I think that's a credit to the people who made the sword and the people who were the customers and, knew what they wanted in a sword for combat purposes, for use in battle. And keep in mind that these historically were weapons. They might have been sidearms that were not used as much as people think they are. However, they were still weapons, and they did still see use. And, a lot of times people try to overemphasize the sidearm aspect. Well, folk just wore swords. They never actually used them. If they never actually used them, they wouldn't bother to wear them, okay? Because while a sword may be less cumbersome than a rifle or a halberd or an axe, it's still a big thing to lug around with you. Yes, you can wear it at your side. They're relatively flat, etc. This is all true. But it's still, why would you carry something like that around with you if you didn't have to, right? If you weren't thinking that you might have to actually use it. You wouldn't. So, keep in mind they were used. It was how they would handle in combat was a consideration. And as a result, a historical sword, a modern sword is something for hobbyists or for people who are doing fencing as a sport or a recreational or athletic activity. Historically, this was something that you might depend on to save your life, to defend your life. So they had to have swords that were as good as they could get and that were as responsive as they could get, and they basically did. The quality of the fittings of some of the originals might be crude compared especially to high-end modern reproductions. I mean, if you look at, some original swords, and then you look at, like an Albion or something, you'll be like, oh my God, the actual sword that was carried in combat compared to the modern reproduction appears crude. And in the sense of some of the finer, polishing and stuff like that, that may be entirely true. However, at the end of the day, overall, how the originals felt might be very different to many modern reproductions. Maybe not to high-end ones, but definitely to many of the swords on the market that most people are familiar with. So, like I said, if you get the chance, handle an original sword at least once in your life, or a reproduction that's made to a high enough standard that it's proportioned similar to an original. Because historical swords just handle differently. Again, on paper, this is a fairly short, fairly wide-bladed, cutting sword, and It's forward weighted like a saber often is, and it just seems that, oh, that should be a big heavy chopper, like a curved cleaver. And it's not. It's light, it's nimble, it's even if you look where its point of balance is, it's fairly far out. But that's the thing. If you just looked at statistics, if you just looked at measurements and numbers written down on paper, you'd have no idea how this sword handles in the hand. You pick it up, you give it a swing, and you're like, oh my God, that's not what I thought it would be, right? And that's the thing. Historical swords often handle differently than we would expect just based on the numbers. And of course, they handle differently than many modern reproductions as well. So if you're really into swords or history or both, and you ever get a chance, handle an original, okay? If you can't, then at least try to get your hands at least once in your life on a modern reproduction that's well enough made that it's proportioned the same as an original. And it'll give you a totally different perspective because original swords really do handle differently. Lone Rider out.